Some tragedies in country music don't end with a funeral. They unfold slowly, in silence. Legends who once ruled Nashville, dominated radio, and filled arenas lived long enough to watch their own names fade from relevance. No final scandal. No dramatic collapse. Just a quiet disappearance while they were still breathing, still creating, still waiting to be remembered. This is the story of 10 country legends who watched their fame die while they were still alive. Merle Haggard. For a long time, Merle Haggard believed his voice would never disappear from country music. And why wouldn't he? He wasn't just successful, he was the sound of working-class America. From prison cells to sold-out arenas, Haggard's songs spoke with a raw authority Nashville couldn't manufacture. In the 1960s and 70s, his records weren't just hits, they were statements. Radio needed him. The industry followed his lead. But country music changed faster than Merle ever expected. As the decades passed, Nashville began polishing its edges. The grit that once defined country became inconvenient. Songs grew cleaner, artists grew safer, and Merle Haggard, still sharp, still writing, still touring, slowly became too traditional for the format he helped define. His records continued to receive critical praise, but radio quietly moved on. Program directors stopped calling. Playlists filled with younger voices imitating authenticity rather than living it. What made the decline especially cruel was that Haggard never truly faded. He kept recording albums. He kept performing for loyal fans who still knew every word. Yet each year, the gap widened between his cultural importance and the attention he received. Award shows celebrated him as a legacy act, not as a living, breathing artist with something left to say. Nashville praised his past while ignoring his present. Haggard watched artists he inspired dominate charts with softened versions of the very themes he once sang for free. The industry embraced outlaw imagery long after it stopped embracing the outlaw himself. And while he was inducted, honored, and applauded, those gestures often felt like substitutions for relevance. Respect replaced opportunity. In interviews during his later years, Merle never hid his bitterness. He understood exactly what had happened. Country music hadn't rejected his talent. It had outgrown its patience for truth. He wasn't willing to bend, simplify, or smooth out the edges that made him Merle Haggard. And so, while still alive, still writing songs worthy of radio, he became invisible to it. When Merle Haggard passed away, tributes poured in. Nashville remembered him loudly, but only after he was gone. The cruel irony remains. One of country music's most honest voices had to watch his relevance die long before his heart ever stopped. Waylon Jennings. Waylon Jennings didn't just become famous in country music. He fought to change it. In the 1970s, when Nashville demanded obedience, polish, and control, Waylon pushed back harder than almost anyone. He demanded creative freedom, owned his sound, and helped ignite the outlaw movement that reshaped the genre. For a time, it worked. His records sold millions, his voice was unmistakable, and the industry, reluctantly, had to follow his lead. But revolutions rarely reward their leaders for long. As the years passed, the very system Waylon challenged learned how to absorb rebellion without surrendering control. Outlaw became an image, a marketing tool, stripped of its danger. Younger artists wore the look without carrying the weight. Meanwhile, Waylon himself began to feel out of place in a genre he had helped liberate. Radio formats tightened. Executives favored cleaner narratives. And the man who once forced Nashville to bend now found himself quietly pushed aside. Waylon was still alive, still recording, still capable of delivering the kind of truth country music claimed to value. But he no longer fit the machine. His health struggles and battles with addiction gave the industry an excuse to label him difficult, even as it profited from the legend he built. Invitations faded. Airplay slowed. His presence became ceremonial rather than essential. What made the decline especially bitter was Waylon's awareness. He knew exactly what was happening. In later interviews, he spoke openly about feeling irrelevant, not because his voice was gone, but because the industry had moved on without him. Nashville celebrated the idea of Waylon Jennings far more than the living man. His name was used to authenticate a genre that no longer made space for him. Waylon watched as artists influenced by his defiance found mainstream success doing safer versions of what once got him in trouble. The edges he fought to keep were now inconvenient, and so he stood on the outside, watching his own revolution leave him behind. When Waylon Jennings died, country music mourned him as a giant. Tributes called him fearless, honest, essential. But the truth is harder to ignore. Long before his death, Waylon had already watched his relevance slip away. Not because he failed country music, but because country music stopped needing the kind of truth he refused to compromise. George Jones. For decades, George Jones was untouchable. In a genre built on heartbreak, regret, and raw emotion, his voice carried a depth no one else could imitate. Singers admired him. Songwriters feared him. When George Jones stepped into a studio, he didn't just record songs, he exposed them. At his peak, Nashville knew one thing for certain. If George Jones sang it, it mattered. But greatness did not protect him from being left behind. As country music evolved, Jones became increasingly defined not by his voice, but by his problems. His battles with addiction, missed shows, and erratic behavior slowly shifted how the industry saw him. Radio stations hesitated. Labels grew cautious. The same man once viewed as irreplaceable became unreliable. And while George worked hard to rebuild his life and career, the damage to his relevance had already begun. What makes Jones's story especially cruel is that his talent never declined. Even in his later years, his voice retained its emotional weight. He could still deliver performances that younger artists could only dream of. Yet the industry treated him like a liability rather than a living legend. Nashville praised his past endlessly, but offered little space for his present. He was invited to be honored, not to be heard. George Jones was painfully aware of this shift. He knew he was being remembered more than he was being supported. Award ceremonies celebrated his legacy while radio quietly ignored new releases. Younger artists cited him as an influence, but the system had no interest in placing him alongside them. His relevance became symbolic rather than real. Perhaps the hardest part was the silence. No official rejection, no public dismissal, just fewer calls, fewer opportunities, fewer reasons given. George Jones didn't wake up one day forgotten. He watched it happen slowly, piece by piece. He lived long enough to see the genre he helped define move forward without him. When George Jones died, the tributes were immediate and overwhelming. Nashville finally spoke loudly again. But beneath the praise lies an uncomfortable truth. One of the greatest voices country music ever produced spent years watching his importance fade. Not because he lost his gift, but because the industry chose convenience over greatness. Tammy Wynette. For a time, Tammy Wynette wasn't just a star. She was the voice of country womanhood. Her songs carried vulnerability, loyalty, and emotional endurance in a way no one else could replicate. When she sang, audiences believed her. In the 1960s and 70s, Tammy's presence on radio was constant. Nashville didn't just promote her, it relied on her. She represented an era when emotional honesty still had a place at the center of country music. But as the years passed, that place began to shrink. Country music slowly distanced itself from the kind of vulnerability Tammy embodied. The industry wanted stronger images, simpler narratives, and safer packaging. Tammy, still recording and still performing, began to feel like a reminder of something Nashville no longer wanted to confront. Her new music struggled for airplay. Her voice, once unavoidable, became absent from radio rotations that had room for nostalgia. But not for relevance. What made her decline especially painful was how quietly it happened. Tammy wasn't pushed out by scandal or collapse. She didn't disappear overnight. Instead, she lived long enough to feel the shift, from essential to optional, from present to past tense. Award shows continued to honor her legacy, but those honors often replaced genuine opportunity. She was celebrated as the first lady of country music, yet treated like a symbol rather than an active artist. Behind the scenes, her health deteriorated. Chronic pain and medical complications followed her through her later years. Yet, even as she struggled physically, she remained committed to her craft. Tammy kept recording, kept touring when she could, and kept believing her voice still mattered. The industry, however, had already made its decision. Her songs no longer fit the sound Nashville was selling. Perhaps the cruelest part was Tammy's awareness. She knew she was being remembered more than she was being heard. She watched younger artists succeed with themes of strength and independence, ideas she had explored decades earlier, often at personal cost. The recognition came too late, and the support faded too early. When Tammy Wynette died, Tributes called her irreplaceable, and she was. But long before her passing, she had already endured a quieter loss. Watching the spotlight drift away while she was still alive, still singing, still hoping country music would listen again. Loretta Lynn. Loretta Lynn built her career by saying what other women in country music were never allowed to say. She didn't soften her stories or ask for permission. She sang about birth control, infidelity, poverty, and female anger with a directness that made Nashville uncomfortable and made audiences listen. For years, her honesty was her power. She wasn't just successful, she was unavoidable. But the industry that once feared her courage eventually grew tired of it. As country music shifted toward safer, more polished narratives, Loretta's voice began to feel inconvenient. Radio programmers quietly moved on. Executives praised her legacy while hesitating to support her present work. She was no longer controversial. She was old-fashioned. And Loretta, still sharp-minded and still writing, lived long enough to recognize the change. What makes her story especially bitter is that Loretta never lost relevance in spirit, only in industry approval. The themes she had once been punished for singing about later became fashionable when younger artists revisited them. Female empowerment, personal truth, and working-class realism returned to country music under new names and new faces. Loretta watched this shift from the sidelines, knowing she had paid the price decades earlier for saying the same things first. Nashville continued to celebrate her as an icon. Museums honored her. Award shows applauded her. But celebration came with distance. She was elevated onto a pedestal where her past could be admired without engaging with her present. Her later albums, often critically praised, rarely received the exposure they deserved. The industry chose comfort over continuity. Loretta understood the contradiction better than anyone. She had survived poverty, sexism, and censorship. But being politely ignored proved harder to fight. She remained proud, outspoken, and unfiltered to the end. She never apologized for her songs or softened her views to regain attention. If the spotlight was going to fade, it would fade on her terms. By the time Loretta Lynn reached the final years of her life, she had already watched her fame transform into something distant and ceremonial. She was remembered constantly, but heard far less often. And that may be the quietest tragedy of all. A woman who changed country music forever lived long enough to see the industry move forward, carrying her influence while leaving her voice behind. Randy Travis. For a brief, powerful moment in the mid-1980s, Randy Travis didn't just succeed. He rescued country music from itself. At a time when the genre was drowning in pop gloss and synthetic production, his deep baritone and traditional sound felt like a correction. Radio embraced him instantly. Nashville held him up as proof that authenticity could still sell. Randy Travis wasn't just a star, he was a solution. But the industry that lifted him up would later turn away just as quietly. As the years passed, Randy's relationship with Nashville grew more complicated. Musical trends shifted again, this time toward younger faces and crossover appeal. His traditional style, once celebrated, began to feel inconvenient. Airplay slowed. New releases struggled to gain attention. Even before personal troubles entered the picture, the spotlight had already begun to dim. Then came the public unraveling. Legal issues, arrests, and personal struggles reshaped how the industry viewed him. What had once been framed as depth and seriousness was now labeled instability. Nashville stopped seeing Randy Travis as an artist worth investing in and began seeing him as a risk. The silence that followed was not loud, but it was decisive. What makes Randy's story especially tragic is how aware he was of the shift. He knew his voice hadn't failed him. He knew his audience still existed. But he also understood that country music no longer had patience for complicated figures from its past. He watched younger artists build careers on the very traditional sound he had revived, while his own name faded from playlists and conversations. Then came the illness. In 2013, a massive stroke robbed Randy Travis of much of his ability to speak and sing. By that point, his fame had already been slipping away. The cruel irony is impossible to ignore. The industry had moved on before his voice was physically taken from him. He lived long enough to see his relevance fade, and then lost the one thing that could have brought it back. In later years, Randy became a symbol rather than a presence. He was brought on stage to be honored, applauded, and remembered. But he was no longer heard in the way he once was. His influence was acknowledged. His contributions were praised. His current existence, however, remained distant from the industry that once depended on him. Randy Travis survived the collapse of his fame, and that survival, watching country music continue without him, became its own quiet form of loss. Don Williams. Don Williams never chased the spotlight. He didn't shout, provoke, or reinvent himself to stay relevant. Instead, he built one of the most quietly powerful careers in country music by doing the opposite. His warm baritone, restrained delivery, and emotional calm made him a refuge in a genre often driven by excess. For years, his presence on radio felt permanent. Don Williams wasn't trendy, he was dependable. And for a long time, that was enough. Until it wasn't. As country music began to favor louder personalities and sharper images, Don's subtlety became a liability. His songs didn't beg for attention. They asked for patience. And patience was something the industry was slowly losing. While he continued recording and touring successfully, radio airplay declined. His name faded from conversations about the genre's future, even as his audience remained loyal and deeply connected. What made Don Williams' fade particularly painful was its invisibility. There was no controversy, no collapse, no public moment where the industry turned on him. Instead, it simply stopped turning toward him. Younger artists took over playlists. Labels prioritized immediacy over longevity. And the gentle giant found himself reclassified, not as an active artist, but as comfort music from another era. Don was aware of it. He understood that country music had changed, and that his style no longer fit the speed of the machine. But unlike others, he didn't fight back. He didn't rebrand. He didn't compromise. He kept doing what he had always done, trusting that sincerity would outlast trends. In many ways, that quiet dignity made the loss sharper. He wasn't rejected for being difficult. He was overlooked for being himself. In his later years, Don Williams continued to perform to packed theaters filled with fans who never stopped caring. Yet industry recognition became increasingly ceremonial. Awards honored his legacy. Tributes praised his influence. But new opportunities were scarce. His present work existed in the shadow of his past, regardless of its quality. Eventually, Don chose to step away. Not in defeat, but in acceptance. He retired without drama, leaving behind a catalog that spoke softly but truthfully. By the time he passed away, country music remembered him fondly. But long before that, he had already watched his relevance drift into the background. Don Williams lived long enough to see the industry move past the kind of calm, honest storytelling he represented. And in a genre that once valued emotional restraint, his quiet disappearance became one of its most overlooked losses. Kris Kristofferson. Kris Kristofferson never fit neatly into Nashville, and for a while, that was exactly why he mattered. He brought intellect, poetry, and moral complexity into a genre that often preferred simplicity. His songs weren't just hits. They were confessions, questions, and contradictions. In the late 1960s and 70s, his writing reshaped what country music could say. For a time, the industry needed him because he offered something it couldn't manufacture. Then the industry decided it no longer wanted to think that hard. As country music grew more commercial and formula-driven, Kristofferson's depth became a problem. His lyrics demanded attention rather than passive listening. His worldview didn't fit clean marketing categories. While artists inspired by his songwriting thrived, Kris himself slowly drifted away from the center. Radio favored cleaner hooks, labels wanted predictability, and Kristofferson, still alive, still writing, still sharp, became increasingly invisible to the system. Unlike many others, Kris didn't disappear because of scandal or collapse. He faded because he refused to simplify himself. He divided his time between music and acting, which Nashville quietly interpreted as disloyalty. The industry prefers artists who belong to it entirely. Kristofferson belonged to ideas, not institutions. And that independence came at a cost. What makes his story especially painful is how aware he was of the shift. Kristofferson understood that his influence was being acknowledged while his presence was being ignored. His songs lived on through others, but his own voice was no longer invited into the conversation. He was praised as a songwriter's songwriter, a phrase that often signals respect without relevance. In later years, his health declined, and public appearances became rarer. But long before that, his role in country music had already been reduced to history. Award shows honored him. Tributes quoted his lyrics. Yet there was little interest in what he had to say now. The industry preserved his past and quietly closed the door on his present. Chris Christopherson lived long enough to watch his legacy become more important than his life's ongoing work. He wasn't rejected. He was archived. And perhaps that is the cruelest fate for an artist whose entire career was built on challenging complacency. Country music still borrows his words, his honesty, and his courage. But the man himself had to watch from a distance as the genre moved forward, carrying his influence while leaving his voice behind. Johnny Paycheck. Johnny Paycheck lived exactly the way country music claimed it respected: raw, defiant, and unapologetically real. His voice carried anger, pride, and bitterness without disguise. When Take This Job and Shove It exploded, Paycheck became the voice of working-class frustration, a symbol of rebellion that Nashville was happy to profit from. For a moment, his honesty made him untouchable. But country music only tolerates rebellion on its own terms. Unlike artists who learned how to soften their edges with age, Johnny Paycheck never adjusted. He didn't clean up his image. He didn't play the industry game. His personal life remained chaotic, his behavior unpredictable, and his defiance constant. What once made him valuable slowly became inconvenient. Radio stations grew cautious, labels distanced themselves, and Paycheck, still alive and still recording, watched opportunity drain away. What separates Paycheck from many others on this list is how clearly he saw the consequences of staying true to himself. He knew exactly why doors were closing. There was no mystery, no confusion, just rejection. The industry that had turned his anger into a hit record had no interest in dealing with the man behind it. His music didn't evolve toward safety, and Nashville responded with silence. As younger artists adopted outlaw aesthetics without the actual risk, Johnny Paycheck was pushed further to the margins. The danger he represented was real, not curated, and real danger is something the industry prefers to keep at arm's length. He continued to tour, often playing smaller venues, watching crowds shrink while the genre grew more polished and controlled. Paycheck's legal troubles and prison time accelerated his fall, but they did not cause it. By the time those events occurred, his relevance had already begun to fade. Nashville had already decided he was more trouble than he was worth. What remained was a man watching the industry rewrite its own history, celebrating rebellion while erasing one of its most authentic rebels. Even in his later years, Johnny Paycheck never asked for forgiveness from a system he never respected. He remained proud, defiant, and painfully aware that his fame had died long before he did. When death finally came, the tributes were muted. The industry remembered the song, not the man. Johnny Paycheck didn't just lose his place in country music. He lived long enough to watch it abandon the kind of truth it once exploited from him. And in doing so, he became a warning. In Nashville, authenticity is celebrated until it refuses to behave. Hank Williams Jr. Hank Williams Jr. was born into a legacy that promised immortality and pressure that few could survive. As the son of Hank Williams, he carried a name that country music would never forget. Early in his career, Nashville tried to mold him into a shadow of his father. When that failed, Hank Jr. fought back, rebuilt himself, and eventually became one of the biggest stars of his generation. For years, his success felt earned, defiant, and unstoppable. Then came the long fade, not of talent, but of acceptance. As country music entered a more tightly controlled era, Hank Jr.'s independence became a problem. He was outspoken, politically charged, and unwilling to filter himself for radio or industry approval. While his fan base remained fiercely loyal, Nashville grew increasingly uncomfortable. Airplay declined, invitations slowed, his presence became controversial rather than essential. What makes Hank Jr.'s story unique is that his fame never fully disappeared, but its support did. He was still selling tickets, still drawing crowds, still very much alive. Yet radio stations quietly distanced themselves. Award shows hesitated. The industry treated him like a liability instead of a legend. His opinions mattered more than his music, and the door that once welcomed him began to close. Hank Jr. knew exactly what was happening. He understood that country music had changed its definition of acceptable. The genre that once celebrated defiance now preferred silence and alignment. And Hank Jr. was never going to offer either. Rather than soften himself to regain favor, he leaned into isolation. If Nashville was done with him, he would be done with Nashville. In later years, his name lived on more as a headline than a voice. Controversy replaced conversation. His influence was undeniable, yet his relevance within the industry was treated as optional. He watched younger artists benefit from the outlaw image while being careful never to cross the same lines he crossed openly. Hank Williams Jr. didn't watch his fame collapse in a single moment. He watched it erode, slowly, deliberately, while he was still standing on stage, still singing to people who never left him. The industry did, and that is the final cruelty of his story. A man born into country music, shaped it in his own image, and then lived long enough to see the system decide it no longer knew what to do with him.